her presentation. Thank you, Dr. Pisano, for being with us.
Thank you, Mayor Tannehill, and for everybody who's joining us tonight. I'm grateful to you because you're here because you care about animals, so thank you. And this presentation will be recorded and you'll be able to share it with anybody you like. If everybody could mute themselves, then there won't be any background noise. I'm hearing a lot of background noise, and maybe Chris can mute the audience. But I hope it's not me. Mayor, do you hear?
I do. I'm going to run in the next room and see if I can get Chris to mute everyone. But you go ahead and get started. Okay, Sarah, everyone is muted. So you can start when you're ready. Hey, Natasha. Okay. Sarah just hung up by accident. There she is. She's back.
All right. Okay, how about now? Can you see my screen and hear me? Okay, awesome. Great, thank you. Sorry about that. So my name is Dr. Sarah Pisano. I'm the founder of Team Shelter USA, and that is a national consulting company. I do assessments all over the United States. I'm also over the assessment and mentorship program at the University of Florida, and I'm on the Million Cat Challenge team. So we're going to talk about, everybody has, I know, a lot of questions about what it means to say the Animal Resource Center. And so we're going to talk about that tonight, and a real broad overarching plans. Like the mayor said, there's some things that are yet to be decided. As things unfold, we'll be keeping you posted. But if you could just keep an open mind, I promise you, I come with very good news. So I've done over 100 assessments in 21 states around the country. The light blue are the states where I've done assessments. So I've been in lots of urban areas, lots of very rural areas, high poverty rates, low poverty rates. And what I learned is that we all empirically, no matter where we live in the United States, we are facing the same challenges in animal welfare. And the good news is that the same solutions are effective everywhere. And that's been such an amazing lesson for me to learn. But the bottom line is that we've been doing things the same way for so long. It's really hard for us to come out of our own microcosm. And I think about our own microcosm. It is unique to each of us. It is what our beliefs are, how we were raised, what our education is, what kind of community did we grow up in, what kind of environment, did we have pets when we were kids, what were our family beliefs around pets. So we all have these beliefs and experiences that affect our opinions. And the other thing that we need to appreciate is that as a human being, we naturally trigger to the negative worst case scenario, and we also amplify the negative worst case scenario. And I say that because I know that a lot of you on your Facebook feeds, you see a lot of abuse and neglect and very sad, horrible stories. But I just wanted to remind you that that's not the whole picture of how all animals are living in our communities in the United States. And when we hold on to those fears of making a mistake and having an animal maybe end up in a bad situation, those fears can be very serious life-saving barriers. And if we could all just make sure we're mute, I'm still hearing a lot of background noise. That would be great. And so as I'm talking through the presentation, I'm going to be talking about things that are different than the way your community or your area may have been doing animal welfare in the past. And I just ask that you have an open mind, because I promise I won't steer you wrong. These are all core recommendations that all the national reputable organizations have created. I didn't make any of this stuff up. I'm just the messenger. But we start with the Association of Shelter Veterinarians that wrote the guidelines for standards of care in animal shelters. And you can find that information on sheltervet.org. And that's kind of the basics, like housing and medical care and all of those things. MillionCatChallenge.org is the organization started about 5 years ago. We set out to save 1 million cats in the United States, and now 5 years later have saved 3 million cats from euthanasia in shelters. So if you haven't visited MillionCatChallenge.org, lots of great information on there. Fear Free is a movement that started in the private sector and is now, thankfully, in sheltering. So all shelters and rescue organizations can get Fear Free certified and learn about normal reactions, normal cat and dog behavior, but also how they act towards or when they're in a stressful situation like the shelter, and how we can help make it a much better environment for them. I encourage everybody, staff at shelters, volunteers, rescue groups, get Fear Free Shelter certified. It's really amazing. I know I took it 2 years and I learned a lot. At the beginning of COVID, we all a whole bunch of people around the country started meeting on Zoom calls because, as you can imagine, just like everybody, we're like, holy cow, what's happening? What's going to happen with our shelters? Can animals get COVID? Is this going to be a major influx for animals into shelters? And those calls grew into the human animal support services that I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. But in any event, all of the information that I've learned over the last 7 and 8 years, and actually my whole career, probably of 27 years, I put in the best practice playbook. And so the mayor has that. This is sort of the playbook and step-by-step and really all the background to what I'm talking about tonight. And the playbook is available on Amazon in an ebook or the paper copy. So the Human Animal Support Services is an international coalition, and it is an amazing compilation of so much great information. So if you don't know about it, please visit humananimalsupportservices.org. And all of these principles is what we're talking about at the national level and what it means to be a resource center. Number one, it doesn't mean that the city pays for everyone and everything and every pet, but it does mean that we want to be a resource to links when we don't have those particular programs. And that's because, number one, when we look at the traditional system of an open admission shelter, typically a public shelter, but certainly could be a private shelter as well, the whole system is flawed. This system was created over 100 years ago, and we have, until recently, not had any barriers or minimal barriers for animals to enter, but then we sure put a whole heck of a lot of barriers to get animals out alive. And we get in trouble in the middle because that's how you lead, how you can get to the overcrowding and all of those negative sequelae. Overcrowding, number one, that's stressful for animals. That means they're more likely to get sick because there's more animals concentrated and it's emotionally stressful for them. When animals are stressed, people are stressed. So this is about us as well and our compassion, fatigue, and protection of our mental well-being, just like the animals. And then staff have to rush and we might not handle animals appropriately. We have decreased life-saving potential and then we're just reactive, right? So all of you know how this feels. I knew I did when I was the public shelter director 15 years ago. I thought, holy cow, how are we ever going to get out of this hole? And so the work that I do now is so exciting because we know so much more, and we know these things are possible that we never thought possible before. When I started in animal welfare and there were empty cages in a shelter, that meant animals were euthanized. Now when I see empty cages in a shelter, I'm like, oh, they were all saved. Isn't that amazing? But when we operate over our capacity for care, we lose the ability to provide a fear-free environment. That environment that is free for animals of stress, anxiety, frustration. We lose that ability. And again, that's for pets and people. So we have to think, if we have shelter space, what is in our control and what is out of our control? And there's so much more that's in our control than out. And that's the point of how we want to recreate this animal resource center, so that shelter intake is not an automatic. That's let's see how else we can help pets and people as opposed to bringing them into the shelter. But we do have a lot of control over how our system works. And that's good because we have finite resources. Whether then people always think of a resource as money, but resources, your shelter space, it's the number of staff you have, it's the number of volunteers, it's partnerships. So we have to think about, what do we have and how can we capitalize on those resources instead of always, well, we don't have a big enough shelter, we don't have enough money, we don't have. We have to think about what we have and use it wisely. And that is going to take us, again, releasing some of our beliefs and opinions about how a shelter should work. We want to work smarter, not harder. I know I have a lot of shelters saying, oh my gosh, like, don't come in here and ask us to work harder. It's just not possible. And that's not what we want to do. We want to work smarter. And that means we're going to save shelter space for animals that we don't have any other alternatives for, so that we can remain within capacity for care. And when animals come in, it's a fear-free environment. It's like summer camp and in a short length of stay. LOS is length of stay. And you're going to hear a lot about that throughout the presentation because it is what makes or breaks the organization. And then, of course, the goal is true euthanasia only, reserving euthanasia only for large, dangerous dogs who we cannot safely rehabilitate. And that's after we have tried training. We've got opinions from trainers and we have opinions from veterinarians and such. And sometimes we have to give up on those dogs that are truly dangerous and large enough to really hurt somebody or, God forbid, kill somebody or another animal. But the other pool is medical cases beyond hope. So all kinds of diseases and issues can be treated in the shelter, in foster homes, with adopters. But I'm talking about medical cases that it doesn't matter what your resources are, that you can't, that pet is beyond hope. So you really need to euthanize them, and it's the kindest thing to do. The benchmark used to be, and in a lot of cases still is, that 90%. And I just want to make sure everybody understands that that's arbitrary, right? Because it depends who's coming in your shelter. What about if you were helping every other animal besides those large, dangerous dogs and medical beyond hope? You can see that your live release rate of that 90% would be lower. So keep that in mind. There's more to the story than just a live release percent. It matters why they were euthanized. The first thing we want to look at when we build this system is the foundation. And responsible public policy can, again, it can pave the path to success or failure. This is the framework. It could be the state law. It could be the local ordinance. We want to make sure that all the laws are in line with best practices. Thankfully, you don't have a stranglehold at your state level, which means that, and you don't have it in your local ordinances either, which is good because you want to make sure you are in line with best practices. And a lot of public policy is very outdated. So I do a lot of work around ordinance revisions, and some things that I look at are, I want to make sure there's no breed-specific legislation or restrictions, of course, because we can't judge dogs by the way they look. the same, like as we shouldn't be judging people by the way they look. We know that pet limits are not correlated to responsible pet care, but a lot of public officials say, oh, well, we had a hoarding case, so we better have this pet limit to prevent that from happening. It doesn't correlate at all. Hoarding is a psychological disease, and pet limits, again, you could have, one person could have 2 dogs and not be able to care for them appropriately, and another person can have 10 dogs and they all are cared for appropriately. So there shouldn't be pet limits in there. There should not be a stray hold for cats or kittens or puppies under 5 months, and provisions for community cats. So there's no barriers for the programs that I'm going to talk about. And you might say, whoa, 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 wait a minute, we want to reunite cats with their owners. So do we, so do I, so does everybody. But I'm going to talk about that in a second, because guess what? The return to owner rate nationally is less than 2%. So the stray hold has done nothing to return cats. We have a better way to return cats. Same thing for puppies. Puppies and kittens are the most vulnerable populations. So we don't want them in the shelter long term. It's very unlikely that a litter of puppies is stray, right? So having a stray hold doesn't benefit them, because they're not going to get reunited with their families, and we can get them into a home much quicker. We want to make sure there's no barriers to reclaiming, or no unnecessary barriers to life saving in general. So that's the first layer. And the next layer is, what does the enforcement program look like? And I can tell you that this is something that has evolved in just the last couple of years. I am so thankful to see communities like Santa Cruz County in California. This is an enforcement team that kept going into these underserved areas and writing citations and taking animals into the shelter, and they weren't getting reunited. And it was the same cycle over and over. So they said, wait a minute, let's see what we can do to help these pet owners be better pet owners. So with no increase in budget, they raised money to, buy dog houses or harnesses and leashes, or to all kinds of different things. They've linked those communities to spay neuter. Access was the biggest issue. And it turns out that we truly don't have all those enforcement cases. Most of it is lack of access to care. And what they did in Santa Cruz and in many other communities is they turned those high intake areas into low intake areas. And one of the things that we also want to see those officers do is return those dogs to their owners in the field, so they don't come into the shelter. So my recommendation is, let's not call him an animal control officer, because this really is more about education and helping people. And of course, if there's enforcement needed, that will happen. But an animal peace officer means I'm going to first see what I can do to help people. And of course, there is a place for punitive enforcement action, but we reserve that for true enforcement cases. If everybody could mute, I'm hearing background noise again. Somebody's not on mute. So access to services and community programs is absolutely crucial. And for every municipality, this is the wise investment. One of the ways to do that is an investment in subsidized spay neuter, which means, who are my high risk groups going into shelters? And if I sterilize them, then I know that I can decrease intake. So we know that the majority of animals belong to fixed income pet owners or low income pet owners. So when we subsidize those surgeries, we can decrease intake. High intake areas, like I talked about, large breed dogs, they're more expensive to sterilize at a veterinarian. They have larger breeds, and you all know that if they go into the shelter, they're much harder to get out than those small breeds. And then community cats, I'm going to talk about separately. You might be asking, like, well, who pays for this, and where is it going to happen, and who's going to do the surgery? So all of those questions are questions and solutions that we're going to be working on. And the answer is, funding is the old-fashioned way. Some of it should come from the municipality, from the city, from the county. Some of it can come from grants and donations. We're talking to the veterinarians in the area to create some programs, because I do know you don't have nonprofit spay neuter clinics, high volume, that are close in the area. I did speak to Mississippi State recently, and they are not going to be doing their mobile program anytime soon, and they're not sure if they're going to be doing it in the future. So that remains to be seen. So all of these things are unfolding, and if anybody has any leads or information or any kind of collaborative opportunities, we're all ears. But we know this is actually Jacksonville, and I love this direct inverse relationship that happens everywhere when you do this right. We know that about 5 of those subsidized surgeries for low-income pet owners per 1,000 people in your community will start to decrease intake. And obviously, the more surgeries that are done, the quicker intake will decrease. So when you look at this graph, the 2 lines, the purple and the red that are going down, that's intake and euthanasia. And the one that's going up is surgery. Look at Waco, Texas. Now that's a community at the time that had a 30% poverty rate, high, almost double the national poverty rate. The same exact trend there. In Huntsville, Alabama, the blue, the top 2 lines are intake and euthanasia, and you see the number of surgeries has been kind of static, and it didn't increase that much. And that's because in Huntsville, they have not had high volume spay neuter clinics. All of those surgeries were done through private veterinary collaboratives. And so again, we want to address how can we cause or provide access in our communities so that there aren't animals born that actually end up in the shelter. And managed admissions means I'm going to first try to help people in a way other than shelter intake. Because before, we were just, remember the funnel, they were just coming in. We weren't asking why they were being surrendered. We were just accepting them in. Sometimes if we were in public shelters that euthanized for space, we were hiding behind this veil of shame and secrecy, and we don't want anybody to know that we're euthanizing, so we're not going to tell anybody. We're just going to have the animals come in, and then we're going to panic, right, and try to get them out alive, but we don't know what to do when we're over capacity. Managed admissions means that I'm not going to trigger to that intake. I'm going to see how I can use my shelter more strategically. Now, I have this graphic there that shows a decrease in shelter intake, but guess what? There may be a time when a shelter in a community is very mature and they are intentionally increasing intake because they're helping other shelters that are euthanizing for space, right? So decreasing intake means I'm decreasing the intake of animals who had other potential options. What might those options be? What about foster care instead of coming into the shelter? What about I can link them to access to veterinary care? What about if I have a community cat and I can get them a voucher to get them spayed or neutered and put them back, shelter, neuter, return, SNR or TNR, same thing, but the TNRs aren't coming into the shelter. And so remember the funnel. Now I'm being proactive and trying to figure out how can I help people and pets other than taking them in the shelter, and that leaves me space for the ones I don't, my emergencies, injuries, true enforcement cases. I need the shelter space for those things, and then I remove barriers to get them out alive. So the proposal is that the staff at the Animal Resource Center is called the help team, and the volunteers are certainly going to be a big part of this, and we hope all of you will be too. I know if you're like me, I judged people for leaving animals in shelters, and I thought, oh, they surrendered their pet, they simply don't care. Well, in the 2015 ASPCA study that I read, it showed up to 80% of the people did not want to surrender their pets. They just didn't have access to resources. And I tell you what, that was a very humbling for me and heartbreaking. And I thought, oh my gosh, all this time I was judging those people when I should have been asking them, what can I do to help you? What can I do to help you keep your pet? And if you can't keep your pet, then how can I help you get your pet directly into a new home? I wanted to also mention an access to care model that's about 5 years old. There's 2 test hospitals. One is in Asheville, North Carolina. It's called Open Door Veterinary Clinic. And one is called the Pet Community Center in Toledo, Ohio. And the founders said, you know what? We think we can marry a financially successful for-profit veterinary hospital with access to care. And they have absolutely proven that. They are netting even above what a normal private practice nets. And they do that through partnership and all these different ways to help people pay for veterinary care. And it's called the Open Door Model. And I'd love to talk to the veterinarians in your community about this too, because it can be adapted in any practice. It could be a nonprofit hospital, it could be a for-profit hospital, or a public shelter run by a clinic, but really exciting. And then you have, I call them bright spots, which I love to talk about shelters like this, because the Brevard Sheriff's Office in Florida, we did an assessment there about a year after the sheriff took over. And we said, listen, you really have to do this managed intake and ask people what they need. And the sheriff was like, that's not going to work here, but we'll try it. And I said, listen, if you help 30% of the animals and they don't come in the shelter, that's amazing. And the very first year, they helped 80% of the owners either keep or place their pets. And that means their owner surrender intake decreased by 80%. That was year 1. That was with no increase in budget. That was with the same staff person that was previously signing all these animals into the shelter, was now asking that question. That was year 1. We're now in year 5. And guess what? Their average is 80%. There's a really great webinar I will actually share with the mayor, so it could be posted, that was done by this organization. And it's just so encouraging to know. Another really encouraging story is the one from Jacksonville, Florida. In Jacksonville, gosh, back in 2002, they were only receiving about 35% of the animals that were going into their shelter. And they were taking in about 34,000 animals between 2 shelters there. So they worked on all these strategies that I'm talking about, and they eventually got to a point where they did not have to euthanize for space. But as summer was approaching one year, they said, oh my gosh, like, we just don't want to go back to euthanizing for space. Hey, Good Samaritan, could you instead foster these animals or a pet that you're bringing to us? We'll give you the supplies. We'll do the vaccines. We'll do the spay neuter, because that's a heck of a lot cheaper than us taking these animals in and trying to save their lives and find them homes. We're going to help you. Can you help us do that and then help find them their permanent homes? So before the program, the year before, only 456 animals went to foster, and most of those were kittens. The very next year, in 1 year, look at what they did. 3,774 animals went to foster instead of coming into the shelter, and the majority of them get adopted either by their fosters or the foster finds them a home. And this is something that works so great in every community, because we never thought, well, of course we should ask the Good Samaritans. They're the ones that care enough to bring the animals to the shelter. Why do they bring them to the shelter? Because we've trained them to do that. We've trained them to think that we at the shelter have all the resources that we need to take care of any number of animals, and that's just not true. There's very few shelters where I can think of where that is actually applicable. So this gives you that ongoing stream. And I know this was a question, well, how do you think you're going to get fosters? This is an ongoing stream with a population that may not have even known about the shelter before they found this pet. Now, mind you, in Jacksonville, they have a very streamlined live outcome program. So those 3,774 pets didn't all come back to the shelter. They went to their live outcome right from foster. Another example, and these are just a few of the examples, but there are many. HomeToHome.org is a platform that's integrated into the shelter website and the Facebook page, and I've already linked the mayor's team with Home to Home. But in any event, a person who, well, look, we tried to find alternatives and they couldn't keep their pet, so they send us a picture and they fill out the form, and we post that information on Home to Home, and we market that as another adoption venue, just like as if animals would be at the shelter for adoption. But the owners hold on to the animals, the owners keep their animals, and they do the direct adoption. We're just kind of helping them link to somebody who's looking for a pet. Adopt a Pet Rehome, I'm sure a lot of you know about and are probably using, but that's online as well. That's a national platform, but not specifically linked to your shelter, but certainly another tool that we should always be using. And then I just wanted to mention, then there's organizations like this, dogsondeployment.org. They're national, and they help veterans and military. Could be active, could be retired, could be somebody who's been discharged, any veteran at any stage of their lives who need help with foster care of their pets for whatever reason. They may need to go in the hospital. They may need to be deployed. This is just another tool. You don't know who you have in your area that, you know, if a military person comes to the shelter in need of help, this is just another tool. And so I just wanted to mention a couple of those really great opportunities that we have now at our fingertips. So doing that managed admission, the safety net, the fosters on deck, meaning I know I have a list of fosters ready when I get animals in. Those programs will make the single greatest impact on those large breed dogs, because people often ask me like, oh my gosh, our biggest problem is the dogs are so reactive and now they're getting aggressive. And that's because, you know what, it's frustrating to be in the shelter and we don't always provide, or we're not able to provide a normal home situation with them, right, in a shelter. So it can be very hard for those large dogs. So keeping those large dogs out of the shelter is the very best thing that we can do for them. Now, cats are a different story, and they have their own section because this is a very major topic in shelters, because cats are twice as likely to be euthanized than dogs in shelters in the United States. Best Friends has the most detailed data of communities in every single county in the United States, or almost every single county in the United States. We also know about 80% of the cats coming into shelters are community cats. Community cats are defined as friendly or unsocialized. They were just outside. And we also know, like I said, nationally, less than 2% of these cats are reunited with their families. So there is no reason to have a stray hold, because it does not lead us to our goal of reunification. And then again, when we don't do this program, when we just have all these community cats coming into the shelter, they're healthy visually, now we have overcapacity issues, we have inhumane housing, that's extremely common, but there is a solution, and it's called shelter neuter return. If they're not coming in the shelter, and this is just a phone call, it might be called trap neuter return, but this is just thinking about a U-turn, not coming into the shelter, but going straight to a spay neuter program. It's sometimes called return to field, which I think is a really bad name, because you're not just putting them out in a field, you're returning them to their original home location. So we know, and I want to say my disclaimer is, back in 2008, when this program started, I thought it was insane. I didn't agree with it. There's no way I'm putting cats back without knowing who the owner is. And then I realized, I'm looking at this cat. They're 12 pounds, 10 pounds, beautiful coat, visually healthy. And if the cat could talk, the cat could say, do I look starving? I am obviously taken care of, and I don't need you. I don't need intervention. Now, spay neuter is what they need, right? But We know that about half of Americans allow their cats access to the outdoors, but we have trained the public, if you see a cat outdoors, take them to the shelter because they must be lost. Well, that is not true, because cats know exactly where they are. They have a territory. I've seen some work with GPS on cats, and they have kind of a big territory. They might go 3, 4, 5 blocks, and they go in circles, like they know where their area is. And several people in the neighborhood think it's their cat. And a lot of these cats are indoor, outdoor. Most of them are socialized. And then, of course, you have your feral population, your unsocialized. But for the most part, these are friendly cats. So the idea is they did not need us. Now, remember, we want to reserve our shelter for animals who really need us. We want to reserve our finite resources for the animals that really need us. So these are cats that don't need us. And some people think, oh, they're all sickly and injured. Well, guess what? Best Friends, again, did a study that showed less than 1% were too sick, ill, or injured to go back. And that was looking at over 100,000 cats in that one particular study. So it happens, and sometimes we do have to euthanize them, but that's certainly not the norm. What we do need to do is stop their reproduction. So we want to spay neuter them. Now they get a rabies vaccination. We ear tip them, so we identify them as sterilized, and we put them right back where they were already cared for. There's times maybe we can't. That's another small ramp. For the most part, they can go back. What if somebody says, I don't want the cats back? Well, let's talk to them and see what the issue is. I know of a case my colleague talks about. This example is this person called to complain that somebody was leaving all these male intact cats on his property, and he wanted animal control to come to his house and pick up all these cats. And we thought that is the craziest thing, because who's going to first put like all these male intact cats in a car? And why would they drop them off at his house? Well, guess what? He had an intact female cat that he allowed outside. So my colleague arranged for all the cats to get sterilized, problem solved. So when you have somebody that can talk to people about solutions and see what the problem is, and certainly help with that spay neuter, that's when this program can work really well. You may be thinking about, well, there's this neighbor that has 30 cats, 40 cats, or there's a trailer park with 40 cats. That's right. That's because nobody was there to help and intervene those first 2 cats and get them sterilized. And that's what we want to work on. What about the kittens? Well, kittens, again, very few of them are going to be ill or injured. Very few of them would have to be euthanized. There may be unsocialized feral kittens that are old enough for surgery. And so a lot of programs do recommend putting those back because they're healthy. They're probably with their mom as well. They came in by themselves. And then the kittens can go into an adoption program, but it's preferable that they don't go into a shelter, right? Because they're the most vulnerable population, the kittens and the puppies. So if there's a way that they can have another adoption stream, that's great, and be sterilized as well. People also panic about those nursing kittens whose mom just went to get something to eat. People panic and think that the kittens were abandoned, and especially with those unsocialized cats, the cats might hide if the people go to check out the kittens. So we need to teach people there's a difference. We need to teach you the difference between the kittens who need intervention and the kittens who don't. Kittenlady.org, if you have not seen Hannah Shaw's work, you really need to go on kittenlady.org. She has so many great webinars, little videos, handouts. She wrote a great book, Tiny But Mighty, about caring for neonates. She has a really good handout on her website about here's the kittens who need help. Here's the kittens that don't need you. Pasco County, Florida has a great shelter too, a great video too called Leave Them Be. It's about 5 minutes talking about this topic. And again, it's to teach our community to know the difference, because when they flood our shelters with neonates and bottle babies, it makes us it's very difficult to save their lives when their mom was already doing the best job taking care of them. But shelter, neuter, return, and of course, targeted TNR is a big piece of this as well. It really is beneficial for everyone. Somebody asked the question, do you mean shelter, neuter, return instead of adoption for those friendly cats? And I said, yes, that is true. That is the case because they already have a home and they most likely have multiple homes. So that is a cat that didn't need our intervention. It is absolutely the fiscally responsible plan for all shelters, whether it's public or private, reserving those finite resources. We know we can decrease the number of outside community cats, so therefore there will be a less negative impact on wildlife and certainly cats going into the shelter. And then we have higher community immunity against rabies, right? We have less cats and more of them are vaccinated against rabies. So actually, the incidence of rabies is going way down as these programs are common. This is the norm now in the United States. And anyway, cats have always made up a very, very tiny piece of the rabies threat. But in any event, the incidents are going down, and there's never been a cat that's been ear tipped that has been found with rabies. More that I know of. And then for anybody who really is in it for the dogs, you can tell them, hey, you need to support this program because now we have more resources and time. That could be volunteers, it could be staff, it could be money, what have you, more enrichment if they do have to enter the shelter. Now we have more resources for dogs. So these are some great visuals. I'm just going to go quickly through some of these charts, but this shows each bar is the year. Green is live, the number of animals number of cats that left alive, and blue is euthanasia. So this program started in 2014 in Nashville, and you can see not only did the intake go down, but there's a dramatic decrease in the blue, which is euthanasia, and a dramatic increase in the green, which is live outcome. In Waco, Texas, remember I told you this is a community that had a very high poverty rate back then. It was 30%. I just checked and it's 25% now, but that's still way above the national average. But look at that first bar. So many cats lost their lives that year. And the years before it looked even worse, but that was the first year they started safety net and community cat programs. And look at the dramatic decrease from 3,500 cats going into the shelter to under 2,500, and now you can see that they ended euthanasia first base pretty quickly. In Greenville, South Carolina, same exact trends. They were so overcrowded with cats. They had tons of upper respiratory infections because of it. They weren't able to provide humane housing, and that's why they had so much upper respiratory. Each year, they got better and better. And then when I went back last year, this kitten had just come in that day, and he was the only kitten in the shelter. He was the only feline in adoptions, and you can see the portal behind him. So now they have portalized cages, and they have very few cats coming in the shelter. But I hope if you're skeptical about this program like I was, that you will take the time to watch our webinar. You can find it on millioncatchallenge.org. I'm just going to stay on this slide for a second in case anybody wants to watch this. You go under resources and webinars and look for the Cat Superhighway. This is chock full of all the most recent studies and research, and goes much more in depth into the benefits and reasons why. This is really the only intervention that has ever been life-saving and fiscally responsible and provided sustainable resolution for constituents. So all of those things that I've talked about so far have been those proactive programs and ways to keep animals out of the shelter. But there are going to be animals that do enter the shelter. I couldn't find an alternative, or for whatever reason, they enter the shelter. So that means that once they enter, my focus is on the shortest length of stay to the best possible outcome. And this is where the capacity for care formula that I talked about in the beginning with the funnels comes in. So the number of animals in has to balance the number of animals out. And there's that LOS again, the length of stay. That is what matters. You can save twice as many animals in one shelter if you have a short length of stay versus a really long length of stay. So some of you have asked, well, what's the capacity at the shelter? How many cages will there be? And all of those things. And we actually are working through the schematics right now. There's some retrofits that are happening that are really exciting, but it's first and foremost to make sure that we have created humane housing and that we make sure this is always balanced so that we do not exceed capacity for care. This is the single most important thing in any shelter anywhere. And again, our goal is to get them out as quickly as possible. And if they are in the shelter, we want it like summer camp. Enrichment is not negotiable. They have to have a soft place to lay down. There must be proper sanitation to keep the pathogens from building up. We need to have things for them to do, not just in their kennels, but for dogs outside of their kennels as well. For cats, interactive toys in their cages or in their free roam room. But enrichment is the most important thing to keep animals healthy, believe it or not. The space we give them, the comfort we give them is what's going to keep them healthier. Now for dogs, Playgroups is an amazing program and something that honestly I never thought possible myself. This is another thing that I thought was crazy and could never happen, but there's nothing that replaces normal play with other dogs. Walking a dog on the leash is still confining to them, but we know that play groups decrease the length of stay because they get adopted quicker. We know there was a fear-free study that showed the stress hormone cortisol was lowered for 24 hours after a 45-minute play group. And it decreased reactivity, which is when you walk by the cage and the dog lunges at the cage. There's two groups that provide training and their philosophies are a little different. So I encourage every shelter to research both of them. One is Dogs Playing for Life and one is Shelter Playgroup Alliance. But I'm going to show you just a clip from a playgroup. Again, I thought this was the craziest thing. This is not possible. This is at Palm Beach Animal Control in Florida, and there are staff and volunteers that are trained to do the playgroups, that are trained to introduce the dogs and know which dogs can go here. And there's some dogs, like my dog Potato that you've been seeing in these pictures, she didn't like playgroups. So she didn't go at her public shelter. She didn't go into playgroups. So they didn't. But you can see that they're just hanging out, having a good time. And some people might say, oh my gosh, they're going to like transmit disease. And listen, disease transmission is always a concern in a shelter. But we also know that fresh air and mental well-being will help their immune systems and they're less likely to get sick, especially because they're going to get out of the shelter quicker. Again, when they come into the shelter, my advocacy starts that moment. One of you asked, as somebody who wants to support the Animal Resource Center and what's happening, how can we help? There is so many ways that you can help, and one is advocating for the animals that do enter the shelter or even on home to home. You can get people interested in fostering. You can have dog day out programs, get people to do foster on deck. You can help take pictures. You can use social media to get the word out. We want to make sure that shelters have convenient hours, that it's a welcoming environment for the public to come in to adopt and see all the animals that are in the shelter, dogs and cats. There may be exceptions like enforcement cases, or if there are highly infectious animals that we're trying to get out for medical care. Maybe there's times that the public wouldn't be able to see those animals, and certainly not like a dangerous dog. But for the rest of the animals, we want the public to see everyone. I have a note about Pima County there, and Pima County, Arizona, they handle about 20,000 animals a year. And at the beginning of COVID, like everyone else, they panicked. They asked their community to come foster. And for most of 2020, they actually had animals come into the dogs in particular, come into the shelter and stay only a few hours to go to a foster on deck and get adopted that way. And that worked really well for them, especially at the beginning of COVID. And then when the animals are in the shelter, of course, you know, thankfully there's a veterinarian on record, but the staff and director need to be doing daily rounds, making sure nobody has any clinical signs. When you don't have a veterinarian on staff, it's challenging, right? So the veterinarian on record can create standard protocols to say, okay, if you see this, this is what you do. If you see this, this is when you call me. We're also in the process of reaching out to all the veterinarians in the community to see who wants to partner with the shelter. And we had a question about leukemia and FIV and if those cats would be euthanized. So in 2020, the AAFP, which is the American Association of Feline Practitioners, they came out with their guidelines that are updated. And so it's no longer a blanket recommendation to even test cats in shelters for FIV and leukemia for several reasons. And I know some of you are like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. And I know it's a little scary, but listen to the statistics. Less than 5% are, or far less than 5% are positive, number one. When they're sterilized, they're not going to transmit, or it's like minimal transition rate. And then for community cats, it's not going to change our decision tree when they're visually healthy. And then lastly, it's not the death sentence that we thought it was when they were first discovered. And guess what? The guidelines actually show studies that a cat can be tested once a week for 4 weeks, and it can be positive, negative, positive, negative. So there's lots of negatives out there that might be positive right now, and we don't even know. So the testing isn't reliable. So what the recommendation is that if you adopt out a cat or kitten, that you tell them to talk to their own private veterinarian about testing and talk about the risks and all of that. But because of the low incidence rate for healthy cats and kittens, we're not recommending it. Now, return to home is another thing that really evolved a lot during COVID, because remember, a lot of shelters had to go emergency only. And so they were only dealing with emergencies, like animal control officers were only picking up emergencies. What we learned, and there's great research or numbers out of Austin, Texas, is that the neighbors were fostering those dogs in particular and getting them home because they were staying in their neighborhood. Remember, the traditional system, we take the dog way out of his neighborhood and put him in the shelter. Now, remember, return to home, for cats, we already got them home much sooner because we did shelter, neuter, return, or TNR. And then, of course, following up on NEID. But our goal for the animal peace officer is not just to bring those dogs into the shelter, is stay in that neighborhood. Go find neighbors, see if anybody can foster, see if anybody knows who the dog belongs to. And I put this little dog in the picture because one of my neighbors brought this dog to me in my neighborhood and said, the dog is lost, should I take it to the shelter? And I said, no, give him to me. And I walked around my neighborhood for exactly, I timed it, 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, I found his owner. My other dog lost her dog. I found her dog. I found her dog in 5 minutes down the road in a neighbor's backyard that was holding them. So neighbors help neighbors. So we want to really encourage neighbors to do this. Say, hey, can you foster this dog just like our regular fosters? We'll give you some food. We'll vaccinate them. Like, can you please help them? Because it's always better for them to stay in a home. Certainly not if they're aggressive, if they're biting or anything like that. Then we would take them into the shelter. The next level is again, or the next topic is open conversational adoptions. And if you're not familiar with Adopters Welcome, that's the cover. It's a guideline written by the Humane Society of the United States. You can get it, you can read it for free on animalsheltering.org, and in the Google space, just put Adopters Welcome. So please, 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 it's really important that everybody read this. It's a very easy read, but I tell you what, again, this came out 4 or 5 years ago, and I sure was humbled by it because I thought, oh, I have to charge a high adoption fee to make sure that it's a good home. Wrong, doesn't correlate with a good home. What this teaches us is our microcosm and our Facebook feeds are filled with those horrible stories. But those horrible stories in the big picture are a very, very tiny percentage of the 144 million pets that are living large and living in families, loving them every day in the United States. And last year, 5.3 million animals went into shelters, and a very, very small percentage of those were victims of cruelty, neglect, or abandonment, true enforcement cases. That means that we need to not judge people who come to us to adopt. We need to remember that only 1 in 4 pets are adopted through a shelter or rescue group, so that us being a barrier does absolutely nothing. Another study showed that 76% of the people who went to breeders or pet stores and purchased animals had already been to a shelter or a rescue group, and it was too cumbersome, invasive, or they were denied. So the key is to welcome people, to trust that people want to do the right thing, and to help them be a good pet owner. So I'm going to counsel them before. I'm going to see what the best fit is for you. This is about making the right match. After adoption, I'm going to call and see how you're doing. How's the trait chaining going? How's the behavior going? Are they using the litter box? All of those things. Again, convenient hours, easy process, and along the lines of a short length of stay, first come, first serve. So that means rescue, transfer, transport, adoption, first come, first serve. This is how we get them out of the shelter, and we keep that balanced. Behavior temp tests are another question that we frequently get. And again, this is my dog Potato, living large. After being a shelter dog, she's getting her laser therapy in that picture. But we need to stop judging not just people that come to adopt, but shelter dogs as well. So behavior temp tests do not correlate with behavior in the home. Why? Because of that fear, anxiety, stress, frustration. They're not acting like their true selves. So we need to not use standardized tests and put dogs in unfair situations, and of course not discriminate because of the way they look. And then we have our, which I mentioned, our rescue and transport programs, the partnerships, and the partnership details will be created with the new director and the mayor's office. So those will be established in the upcoming weeks. Shelter Love is the software that the Animal Resource Center will be using, and that's a really modern software. The communication will be streamlined with respect to search engines and communication with rescues and fosters and transport partners. And there's lots of other great virtual tools. Dubert has one. Dubert's a transport connector. You can look at them on, it's dubert.com, I believe. And Foster Space is a part of that, and that's new, and it's a way to communicate with fosters and adopters. Same with Maddie's Pet Assistant. So there's lots of virtual ways to now communicate about the needs of shelter pets and our stakeholders and partners. So there's no reason to be making individual phone calls anymore to get the word out. There was a question about, well, several questions about spay neuter, and the answer is that there's always should be the consistent goal that all pets are sterilized before leaving the shelter if they're large enough for surgery. But when you do not have on-site spay neuter, this logistically becomes extremely difficult. And so, as I mentioned, there will be MOUs with veterinarians, where we'll be offered to veterinarians and looking for all kinds of surgery options to get animals sterilized quickly. But what we cannot do is hold animals in the shelter waiting for a surgery appointment that we might not have for a week or two. So then the animals would leave as a foster to adopt, for example, so they wouldn't be legally adopted until they were sterilized. They'd still be in that foster status. And then rescue and transports are different because those groups are, and typically the destination shelters will
neuter animal.
And so they will be responsible for the spay neuter, but certainly our goal is to get everybody sterilized before they leave. There was also a question about weight. And so the norm now for kittens is 1.5 pounds. There's in shelters, that's pretty much the norm, and it's been done safely for many, many years. Private veterinarians don't often feel comfortable doing kittens and puppies when they're super young. So it really is going to depend on the veterinarian. But for high volume, high quality spay neuter programs, 1.5 pounds for the kittens is now standard. So just to summarize, the help team means staff and volunteers are going to look for ways to link pet owners with spay neuter and access to veterinary care. Hopefully some of the veterinarians in your area will be interested in Open Door, and I would love to speak to them about the concept of Open Door and access to care. And then managed admissions means I'm going to try to help these pets and people in ways other than shelter intake. I'm going to make sure community cats get sterilized and don't enter the system. And whenever possible, making appointments for intake will help me provide better care and plan my resources better. But certainly there will be emergencies and times when animals have to enter the shelter. And if they do enter the shelter, we want to make sure it's with the shortest length of stay. And then all these different opportunities and outcomes will depend on not just the staff, but so many of you. Volunteers are needed for advocacy, enrichment, and everything else. So we're really looking forward to being this great model in the country. And you know that everybody is really passionate and compassionate about animals. So just a reminder that we need to be kind to each other too and respect our microcosms and everyone else's, because we all come from different perspectives, but all of us want what my dog and cat look like in this picture. That's really what we want, and we have to focus on that end goal and work together so that we can do the best we can for them. I want to thank the mayor and her team for inviting me to Oxford, and I'm really excited about what's to come and to work with you all. And I will turn it over to the mayor now. Thank you.
Tubbs. What about Tubbs Spay and Neuter? I mean, that's a program here.
Thank you, Sarah, for your wisdom and for all the guidance that you have given us thus far. I am going to try to answer some of the questions that were provided prior to us going live tonight. And, you know, some of the questions were regarding budget and staff and oversight and the building. You know, we will be utilizing the current building. Renovations have already begun, and improvements are being made after consultation with Dr. Pisano. She came to Oxford and toured our building and helped us determine how to best restructure the space and how we can use it much more effectively. We've also toured the animal shelters in both Memphis and Tupelo, and we had the director of the Tupelo Animal Shelter come and also walk through our shelter and make recommendations about improvements and renovations that needed to be made. We have had a consultation with Shoreline, which manufactures kennels, and they have helped us figure out the best way to utilize our space the most efficiently. Those of you who are familiar with the building know that there has been an unfinished room that has been primarily used for storage. This room will be finished out, and we will have separate entries for intake and for adoption. And we are working on that layout now. One thing that our building will be missing after we finish that room out is storage. So we are going to get a pod of some sort that we're working to secure right now to be utilized for storage for our food and all of those things as well. We have established a budget for the first year that is right under $1 million. This budget includes capital improvements that won't be included every year. In this budget, we included salaries for 6 full-time employees and 4 part-time employees. Our staff plan is fluid right now. We have interviewed several candidates for the director's position, and we hope to have that person in place very soon. And we'll really determine what the skill sets and tasks of the additional positions will be based on the strengths and experience of the director that we hire. The director will be the one that will be setting up all of the training with Dr. Pisano's help, and we will be working on that training plan with the director. I want to point out that $1 million is not easy to come by in our city budget, as you can imagine. We don't have $1 million just sitting around. So this million will mean that there will be other projects that have to be eliminated. That means that some of our street paving projects or, other things will have to wait, that capital improvements for things like the city pool that desperately needs help will have to wait. But we are committed to funding this animal resource center. There was a question asking if we would be offering a decent wage so that good workers would have a reason to stay. I do believe that we are offering a competitive salary for the director's position. One of the first things that I did when elected mayor was ask the board to raise the minimum wage for full-time city employees to $13 an hour. So a full-time animal care attendant is currently making $13 an hour. The Oxford Police Department continues to handle our animal control calls. So currently the animal control officer is a certified law enforcement officer. We had that question. We don't know that this will always be the case, but it is for now. We have reunited most of the animals that have been brought in with their owners. We've transported 4 animals to Tupelo. We have some kittens in foster care and have adopted out several animals. There are currently no animals inside the resource centers. There was a question about enforcement of city dog licenses. We do plan to enforce this ordinance. We are working with Dr. Pisano and our city attorney now to review all of our ordinances and fee structures, and we'll be making changes where needed there. There was a question about a timeline. We are committed to putting the right pieces in place to offer the best care to our animals and our citizens that we possibly can. We don't have a hard timeline. Like I said, we're committed to getting it correct, not rushed. There were questions about the relationship with the county. We are working through that now with the Board of Supervisors. We believe that there will be a partnership, but I think it's important for you all to know that the City of Oxford is committed to going forward either way. There were questions about city and county liaisons and a board of directors. The Animal Resource Center will not be managed by a nonprofit any longer. It will be a city department. So it will be the same as the Oxford Park Commission or Oxford Utilities or any other city department. So we want to appoint a board immediately. Until the Animal Rescue Center is established and running efficiently, the Board of Aldermen and the Board of Supervisors, if they choose to partner with us, will be the board. And there will be daily oversight like there is with any other city department. Like any other city department, we'll evaluate staff and policies and procedures and oversee equipment like the animal peace officer vehicle and those kinds of things. We will continue to rely heavily on guidance from Dr. Pisano as we move forward. We had questions about a spay-neuter clinic. We will not have a spay-neuter clinic on site. We are hoping to involve every veterinary clinic in town. We have asked every clinic to provide us with rates, as Dr. Pisano said earlier. And once we have a director, we'll put more concrete plans in place. But we'd love to work towards an on-site clinic at some date, but that won't be where we start for sure. We'd love to utilize the Tubbs Spay and Neuter Clinic and any other spay and neuter opportunities that we have for animals. Transparency is going to be a top priority for us. A lot of the questions that we've been asked are quite honestly tied to a lack of trust, and I get that. I want to assure you that the future of the Animal Resource Center will be totally different from the shelter versions that we've seen in the past. We are going to share data regarding intake and adoptions and fosters. We will be transparent with our policies and our procedures. We will follow all state regulations, and we will welcome questions from the community and your input as we move forward. Now, there are some questions that have been posed that we simply just don't have an answer for yet. Many of the things are still in the development stage, and our goal is to keep you in the loop as we move forward. But know that there are things that are still in the beginning stages that we simply don't have a concrete answer for yet. But I want to thank all of you who submitted questions. I want to thank you, those of you who have or are fostering animals. I want to say thank you to those of you who have emailed to say that you'd like to be involved in the help team moving forward. If you would like to be involved and haven't emailed us yet, you can do that at cityhall@oxfordms.net. And I invite you all to stay tuned, and we will keep you posted on our progress as we move forward. Thank you all, and this will be posted as a live video to our YouTube channel. And so we invite you to share it and to rewatch it if you missed anything. And thank you for joining us. Have a good night.